What happens when an execution doesn't go as planned? Lethal injection failures, electric chair malfunctions, and even inmates who seemingly refuse to die. Botched executions have left a dark stain on the history of capital punishment in the U.S. Some prisoners endured prolonged agony, while others barely survived before being executed again. Today, we uncover the most shocking cases of botched executions in America, the horrifying details of what went wrong, and what happens if an inmate survives. Stay tuned for the chilling truth. Clayton Lockett, State, Oklahoma. Execution date, April 29, 2014. Clayton Lockett was convicted for the 1999 murder of 19-year-old Stephanie Neiman during a home invasion. Lockett and his accomplices beat, raped, and shot Neiman, then buried her alive when she refused to provide security codes for the home. He was sentenced to death in 2000. Lockett's execution became one of the most botched and horrifying lethal injections in modern U.S. history. Oklahoma was using a new, untested three-drug combination, which included midazolam, a sedative, vecuronium bromide, a paralytic, and potassium chloride to stop the heart. From the beginning, things went terribly wrong. The fourth line was improperly inserted, which caused the lethal drugs to leak into the surrounding tissue instead of entering his bloodstream as intended. This failure prevented the drugs from working effectively, leading to a prolonged and agonizing execution process. As the drugs took effect, Lockett began to convulse, thrash, and groan in pain, despite having been declared unconscious. Witnesses described the scene as disturbing, with Lockett visibly struggling against the effects of the chemicals that were meant to render him motionless and pain-free. At one point, he lifted his head and attempted to speak, sending shock waves through the execution chamber. The horrifying moment left witnesses, including prison officials and journalists, shaken by the apparent failure of the procedure. Recognizing that something had gone terribly wrong, officials halted the execution 33 minutes after it began. However, despite the intervention, Lockett died of a heart attack 10 minutes later. In total, he suffered for 43 minutes before finally succumbing, a stark contrast to the quick and painless death that lethal injection is intended to provide. Lockett's botched execution drew international outrage and led to a temporary suspension of executions in Oklahoma. His case exposed serious flaws in lethal injection protocols, particularly with the use of experimental drugs. Jesse Tafero, State, Florida. Execution date, May 4, 1990. Jesse Tafero's execution was one of the most infamous botched executions in U.S. history. On May 4, 1990, he was strapped into Florida's electric chair, prepared for the standard execution procedure. However, things quickly took a gruesome turn due to a critical error in the setup. The sponge used in the electrocution process was synthetic instead of natural, which failed to conduct electricity properly. As a result, rather than delivering a quick and effective execution, the malfunction caused flames to erupt from Tafero's head in front of horrified witnesses. The execution chamber quickly filled with a stench of burning flesh, creating a gruesome scene that many onlookers would never forget. Despite the horrific error, the process continued for 2 more jolts before Tafero was finally pronounced dead. In total, it took 3 attempts to complete the execution, making it one of the most disturbing and controversial cases of the death penalty gone wrong. Jesse Tafero was pronounced dead at 7:13 a.m. This tragic event occurred because Tafero had been wrongfully convicted of the 1976 murders of 2 police officers during a botched robbery attempt in Florida. Years later, new evidence, including ballistics tests, revealed that Tafero was innocent of the crime. He was posthumously exonerated. His case became a heartbreaking example of the flaws in the criminal justice system and the irreversible consequences of wrongful convictions. George W. Barrett, State, Tennessee. Execution date, March 30, 1945. George W. Barrett also known as Machine Gun Barrett, was convicted of murdering a federal agent, Tom Davis, in 1936. He became the first person in U.S. history to be sentenced to death under the federal law for killing a federal officer. His execution, however, turned into a horrifying spectacle due to a malfunction in Tennessee's electric chair. At around midnight, prison officials strapped Barrett into the electric chair at Tennessee State Penitentiary. When the first jolt of electricity was administered, it failed to render him immediately unconscious. Instead, his body convulsed violently, and witnesses saw him gasping and straining against the restraints. The failure of the initial surge to kill him outright led to a prolonged and agonizing process. Prison officials attempted to correct the issue, administering a second shock. Yet again, the execution did not go as planned. Smoke began to rise, and the stench of burning flesh filled the execution chamber. Witnesses, including members of the press and prison staff, watched in horror as Barrett remained semi-conscious, enduring what was described as an excruciatingly painful death. Finally, after multiple attempts and a prolonged series of electrical surges, Barrett was pronounced dead at approximately 12:15 a.m. His botched execution became one of the most gruesome in Tennessee's history, raising concerns about the reliability and humanity of the electric chair as a method of execution. Willie Francis. State, Louisiana. Execution. Date, May 9, 1947. At just 17 years old, Willie Francis became the first known person to survive an execution attempt in the United States. Convicted of murdering his former employer, Andrew Thomas, in 1944, he was sentenced to die in Louisiana's electric chair, known as Gruesome Gertie. On May 3, 1946, he was led to the execution chamber at Louisiana State Penitentiary. Prison guards, reportedly intoxicated while setting up the chair, failed to properly connect the electrodes. When the switch was thrown, Francis convulsed violently but did not lose consciousness. Instead, he screamed in pain, shouting, "Take it off! Let me breathe!" The botched execution horrified witnesses as the machine sputtered and failed to deliver a fatal shock. Officials were forced to halt the execution, and Francis was removed from the chair still alive. His survival led to a legal battle that reached the U.S. Supreme Court in the case Francis v. Resweber in 1947. His lawyers argued that executing him a second time would violate the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. However, the Supreme Court ruled in a 5-4 decision that a second execution attempt did not constitute double jeopardy or cruel punishment, since the state had not intentionally caused the failure. On May 9, 1947, 1 year after the failed attempt, Francis was strapped back into the electric chair. This time, the execution went as planned. At 12:10 p.m., after a deadly surge of electricity, he was pronounced dead. His case remains one of the most infamous examples of a botched execution in U.S. history, sparking debates about the ethics and reliability of the death penalty. John Lewis Evans, State, Alabama. Execution date, April 22, 1983. John Lewis Evans, a convicted murderer from Alabama, became the subject of one of the state's most controversial and gruesome executions. Evans was convicted for the 1977 murder of Edward Nassar, a pawn shop owner in Mobile, Alabama. Evans had been sentenced to death, and on April 22, 1983, he was strapped into Alabama's notorious electric chair, known as Yellow Mama. This was the first execution in Alabama since the reinstatement of the death penalty following the Supreme Court's decision to lift the ban in 1976. As the execution commenced, a 1,900-volt charge was sent through Evans' body. However, unlike previous executions, this one was tragically botched. Evans' body began to convulse violently, and witnesses reported seeing smoke rise from his leg as the electricity surged through him. Despite the violent convulsions and the gruesome spectacle, Evans was not immediately pronounced dead. A second jolt of electricity was administered, but Evans' heart continued to beat. In a final attempt to end his life, a third jolt was delivered. After 14 long minutes, Evans was finally pronounced dead, but the execution had taken a gruesome toll on his body and the witnesses present. The horrifying nature of Evans' execution shocked those who watched it. The incident prompted widespread criticism of the electric chair as a method of execution and led to calls for reform in Alabama's execution procedures. Many viewed the drawn-out death as barbaric, and it highlighted the inherent flaws and dangers in the use of electrocution, especially given the evident suffering that Evans endured. Despite the controversy, Alabama continued to use Yellow Mama for executions until 2002, when lethal injection became the primary method. Evans' botched execution remains a tragic example of the problems that can arise in the pursuit of justice through the death penalty. Allen Lee Davis, State, Florida. Execution date, July 8, 1999. Allen Lee Davis was convicted for the 1982 murder of Chandra Whitehead and her two young daughters, Tynisha Whitehead and Chandra's unborn child, in Florida. Davis, who had a long criminal history, brutally shot and killed the three victims during a robbery. He was arrested shortly after the murders and convicted of first-degree murder. In 1999, after years of legal appeals, Davis was scheduled for execution, and on July 8, 1999, he was strapped into Florida's electric chair for his execution. What went wrong during Davis's execution was both disturbing and shocking. As the execution began, the electric chair malfunctioned in a way that caused Davis to bleed profusely from his nose, a situation that was never witnessed before in Florida executions. As the voltage surged through his body, his shirt became soaked in blood, and his face turned purple from the effects of the electrocution. Witnesses to the execution were horrified as Davis' body convulsed violently, and the room was filled with the disturbing sight of blood and smoke. The method of electrocution, particularly the intensity of the electrical current, caused a prolonged and visibly painful death. His execution lasted much longer than expected, with Davis taking much longer to die than most others who were executed in the electric chair. The combination of blood, smoke, and the grotesque convulsions left the witnesses in shock, and the execution was described as one of the most disturbing in Florida's history. The execution began at 7:05 p.m., and Davis was pronounced dead at 7:19 p.m., making his time of death 14 minutes after the first electrical jolt. Pedro Medina, State, Florida. Execution date, March 25, 1997. Pedro Medina was executed in Florida's electric chair on March 25, 1997, for the murder of Dorothy James, a 52-year-old schoolteacher, in 1982. His execution became one of the most infamous botched executions in U.S. history due to a horrific mechanical failure that led to his head catching on fire. When the electric current was activated, flames erupted from Medina's head, sending smoke billowing through the execution chamber. Witnesses were horrified as the smell of burning flesh filled the room. Despite the first jolt, Medina continued to move, leading to concerns that he was still conscious and in excruciating pain. The shocking scene lasted several minutes, with officials scrambling to control the situation. Medina's last words were not recorded, as he reportedly remained silent before the execution began. After a prolonged and gruesome process, he was officially pronounced dead at 7:10 a.m. His execution reignited debates about the use of the electric chair, with critics arguing that it was inhumane. The incident played a significant role in Florida's decision to switch to lethal injection as its primary method of execution in 2000. Frank J. Coppola, State, Virginia. Execution date, August 10, 1982. Frank J. Coppola was executed in Virginia on August 10, 1982, using the electric chair. The electric current surged through his body, causing extreme burns to his head and legs. As the voltage coursed through him, smoke filled the execution chamber, and Coppola's head caught on fire. Despite the intense and horrific nature of the execution, Coppola continued to suffer as the procedure went on. Witnesses described the gruesome scene as Coppola struggled in the chair before he finally died. This botched execution added to the growing calls for reform in the death penalty process and ultimately led to Virginia moving toward lethal injection as the primary method of execution. The official time of death was not immediately reported, but witnesses noted that it took several minutes before Coppola was pronounced dead. The length of the procedure, along with the extreme suffering he endured, highlighted the disturbing nature of the execution. Coppola's last words were not documented, as the focus shifted more to the gruesome details of the execution than any final statement he may have made. Ricky Ray Rector, State, Arkansas. Execution date, January 24, 1992. Ricky Ray Rector was convicted of the 1981 murder of a police officer during a robbery in Little Rock, Arkansas. He was sentenced to death and executed on January 24, 1992, by lethal injection. However, Rector's case became highly controversial due to his mental condition. Prior to the crime, Rector had attempted suicide, which resulted in severe brain damage, leaving him mentally impaired. As a result, he was unable to fully comprehend the nature of his execution. The details surrounding his last meal were unsettling, as witnesses reported that he left a portion of his meal, specifically his dessert, uneaten. Rector was reportedly under the impression that he would return to finish it after his execution, a sign of his diminished capacity to understand the reality of his situation. His mental state led to widespread debate about the fairness and ethics of executing someone who was not fully aware of the reasons for their punishment. Rector's final words are not widely documented, as he did not speak before his execution. His death, which was the result of a botched understanding of the execution process, left a lasting impact on the debate surrounding the death penalty in the United States. His execution took place on the evening of January 24, 1992, and he was pronounced dead shortly after the lethal injection was administered. Angel Neves Diaz, State, Florida. Execution date, December 13, 2006. Angel Neves Diaz was sentenced to death for the 1979 murder of a Miami strip club manager. Despite maintaining his innocence until the very end, he was executed by lethal injection on December 13, 2006 in Florida. His execution became one of the most infamous botched lethal injections in U.S. history due to a critical error in the administration of the drugs. Typically, lethal injection is designed to be quick and painless, with the drugs flowing directly into a prisoner's veins. However, in Diaz's case, the execution team mistakenly injected the lethal chemicals into his soft tissue instead of his veins. This caused the drugs to be absorbed much more slowly, leading to a prolonged and agonizing death. Witnesses reported that Diaz remained conscious for an unusually long time, grimacing, blinking, and even moving his mouth as if trying to speak. Instead of losing consciousness almost immediately, as intended, he struggled visibly for over 20 minutes. After it became clear that the initial dose had failed, the execution team administered a second round of lethal drugs in an attempt to complete the execution. However, by this point, Diaz had already suffered extensively. It ultimately took a staggering 30 minutes for him to be pronounced dead, one of the longest lethal injection executions ever recorded. An autopsy later revealed large chemical burns on Diaz's arms where the drugs had been injected, confirming that the execution team had made a fatal mistake. The incident prompted widespread criticism of Florida's lethal injection procedure, leading the state to temporarily halt executions and review its protocols. Diaz declined a special last meal, opting instead to receive the standard prison meal. His final words were spoken in Spanish, which translated to, "The state of Florida is killing an innocent person." The death penalty is an act of vengeance, but also a cowardly act by humans. I am innocent, and words cannot express what I feel. But I can tell you this: I leave with a clear conscience. I leave with the peace of knowing I was innocent. I say this to the truth seekers and the defenders of justice. You will see that time will prove me right. I am free. Even in his final moments, Diaz remained defiant, asserting that he had been wrongly convicted. Doyle Ham, State, Alabama. Execution date, February 22, 2018. Doyle Ham, a convicted murderer suffering from terminal cancer, was scheduled for execution by lethal injection in Alabama. However, due to years of intravenous drug use and his deteriorating health, his veins were severely compromised. The execution team struggled for nearly 2.5 hours, repeatedly attempting to insert an IV into his arms, legs, feet, and groin. Witnesses reported that Ham was in visible pain as needles were inserted and removed multiple times. Despite their efforts, the execution team failed to establish a viable IV line. The procedure was eventually halted, and Ham was returned to his cell, covered in bruises and puncture wounds. His legal team later revealed that he had bled profusely due to the failed attempts. Ham's attorneys had previously warned that his medical condition made lethal injection risky and inhumane, arguing that it would likely result in a botched execution. After the failed procedure, Alabama officials agreed not to attempt another execution. Ham ultimately died of natural causes from cancer on November 28, 2021. Joseph Rudolph Wood III, State, Arizona. Execution date, July 23, 2014. Joseph Wood was convicted of the 1989 murders of his ex-girlfriend, Deborah Dietz, and her father, Eugene Dietz, in Tucson, Arizona. Wood had a history of domestic violence, and after Deborah ended their relationship, he entered her family's auto shop, shot her father in the chest, and then turned the gun on Deborah, shooting her multiple times. He was sentenced to death in 1991 after being found guilty of the brutal double homicide. His execution became one of the most prolonged and controversial in U.S. history. Arizona prison officials used a two-drug combination of midazolam and hydromorphone, a largely untested method at the time. Instead of quickly losing consciousness, as intended, Wood gasped, choked, and struggled for nearly 2 hours. Witnesses reported hearing him snorting and gulping for air over 600 times, describing the scene as agonizing and inhumane. His legal team had tried to delay the execution, arguing that the drugs had not been properly tested and could cause unnecessary suffering, but their appeals were denied. Arizona did not allow inmates to request special last meals, so Wood was served the standard prison meal before his execution. He did not give a final statement before the lethal drugs were administered. Wood was pronounced dead at 3:49 p.m., nearly 2 hours after the drugs were first injected at 1:52 p.m. His prolonged death sparked national outrage, with critics arguing it violated the Eighth Amendment's prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. The case led to increased legal scrutiny over lethal injection protocols, prompting many states to reconsider their drug combinations or place moratoriums on executions. James David Autry, State, Texas. Execution date, March 14, 1984. James David Autry was convicted of the 1980 murder of Port Arthur convenience store clerk Shirley Drouet, whom he shot in the head over a dispute about a pack of cigarettes. The crime also left 2 other store employees wounded. Autry, a former Marine, was sentenced to death in 1981 and remained on death row for 3 years before his execution. His execution by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas was one of the earliest lethal injections carried out in the United States, following the method's adoption as a more humane alternative to the electric chair. However, Autry's execution did not go as planned. After being injected with the drugs, he remained conscious for an extended period, gasping, choking, and struggling before finally losing consciousness. The unsettling scene shocked witnesses, raising concerns about the effectiveness of Texas's lethal injection protocol. Before his execution, Autry requested a last meal of a hamburger, French fries, and a Dr. Pepper. His final words were addressed to his family as he calmly stated, "I appreciate the people who tried to help me. They know who they are. I hope that this will bring some peace to my family, and I regret what I did." Autry was pronounced dead at 12:50 a.m., but the complications surrounding his execution led to increased scrutiny over the use of lethal injection, with some questioning whether it was as painless as intended. Botched executions reveal the horrifying reality behind the death penalty. These cases show that even in modern times, lethal injections, electric chairs, and other methods can go terribly wrong. Some inmates endured unspeakable pain before dying, while others survived their own executions. What do you think about the death penalty after hearing these cases? Let us know in the comments, and if you want more true crime stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe.